Right, welcome back. That was a short little break. The next panel is called The New Arctic Security Environment, Technological Solutions to Arctic Challenges. And our moderator today is Mark McWhinney. He's a political science PhD candidate at Carleton University, and he's worked on climate change issues through a bilateral cooperative lens. Specifically, he's targeting carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, sustainable fuel development as crucial means for reaching net zero. So thank you so much, Mark, for being here with us today, and over to you for this panel.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I wish I was at the candidacy stage of my PhD, but I'm still a student right now, so I got a little bit of time to go. But what we're covering in this portion of the summit, I think, is very interesting and very exciting. Because I think that we'll be able to get a practitioner's perspective on some of these issues that we've already encountered in the first few sessions. And I'm surrounded here today by a great group of panelists, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. So if you do have any questions, of course, feel free to add them in the chat as we've been doing. But it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the panel. First is Dr. Brian Wells, Chief Scientist at Nato, Chair of the Nato Science and Technology Board, and the Senior Scientific Advisor to Nato Leadership. We're also joined by Elise Perret, the National Practice Lead for Climate Risk and Resilience at WSP, and alongside her many advisory responsibilities, she sits at the Resilient Built and Natural Infrastructure Advisory Table for Canada's first National Adaptation Strategy. And finally, we are very happy to be joined by Madeleine Redfern, former mayor of Iqaluit, and strategic advisory positions include but are not limited to the Canadian North Advisory Board, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and the National Indigenous Economic Development organization, and she is also the Chief Operating Officer of Can-Arctic Inuit Networks. So I'll pass the torch over to Brian to get us started with introductions. We'll move through those, and then I've got a number of issue areas that we can go through, and then finally arrive at some Q&A with the audience. So Brian, if you want to take the lead, go right ahead.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, greetings virtually from Brussels from me. I'd like in these opening remarks to highlight really three areas. First of all, why climate change matters to NATO. Secondly, NATO's overall approach to climate change. And thirdly, as Chief Scientist to NATO, what science NATO is doing on climate change. So first of all, why climate change matters to NATO. Well, climate change is going to affect NATO security. It already does affect NATO's security, its operations now and in the future, and its missions in the Euro-Atlantic area, but also in the alliance's broader neighbourhood. It shapes clearly the geopolitical environment, again in NATO's sphere of interest, and the High North is, as we all know, one of the key centres so far as climate change is concerned. And we can expect NATO's forces to be operating in harsher conditions, either of greater temperature, or indeed in areas of residual extreme cold. We can expect NATO forces to be called on to support new humanitarian missions, as we can easily anticipate migration as a result of water shortages and food shortages. And indeed, many of NATO's own bases are very close to the shore, and so are vulnerable to rising sea levels. So for all of these reasons, NATO takes climate change very seriously. And I should add that NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, is a former UN Special Envoy on climate change. So this is something that matters personally to him, and something that NATO is taking very seriously. So overall, what is NATO doing? At the NATO summit in June of last year, NATO leaders agreed a climate change and security action plan. And the overall aim of the action plan is to make NATO the leading international organization when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change in security. So that is the level of NATO's ambition in this. And the action plan is underpinned by 4 pillars. First is the increased awareness of climate change on security. The second is the adaptation of NATO to climate change in terms of its missions and operations. The third is the mitigation of climate change. And finally, working with partners through NATO. And I'll just unpick those a little bit and highlight briefly how the science links into this. So in terms of increased awareness of the impact of climate change, we are looking at the impact of climate change on NATO's own installations and its current and future missions and operations. And we're undertaking research on the impact of climate change, and I'll come back to that in my third part of this opening remark. Secondly, in adaptation, we're looking at how NATO's preparedness, its resilience and planning need to take account of climate change. And in a scientific sense, operational research and analysis is an important contributor to this. In terms of the mitigation of the impact of climate change, we're looking at ways to reduce the use of greenhouse gas emissions in operations and missions, and as part of that, the use of new technologies. And finally, in partnerships, we're looking to work with like-minded partners across the globe and with other international organizations, including the OECD, the United Nations, and the European Commission. And again, science and technology is an important element of this. So looking, as it were, from the overall picture and drilling down into the science, as I've already said, science makes an important contribution to all 4 pillars of NATO's climate change action plan. The key element in our science program on climate change awareness is from the NATO's own laboratory, the Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation, which is based at La Spezia in Italy. This has world-class research vessels, and one of them, the largest of the 2 research vessels that NATO owns, is an ice-capable research vessel. And this undertakes annual deployments into the High North, principally to do security and defense research around anti-submarine warfare and naval mine countermeasures, but it also monitors the impact of climate change in the oceans. And last year it looked in particular at the impact of the melting of the Greenland ice cap, which puts a very significant amount of cold water and fresh water into an ocean of a higher temperature and a higher salt content. This environmental monitoring uses very sophisticated autonomous systems with state-of-the-art sensors, and given the scale of the databases being collected, there is very sophisticated use of artificial intelligence in order to make sense of the results. So that is a unique contribution of NATO science into increasing our understanding of climate change in the maritime area. But we're also looking at other areas of science as well. Alternative fuels, for example. We're looking at alternative aviation fuels and alternatives propulsion techniques as well. We're also doing quite a lot of work on supporting our forces in working in extreme environments, either extreme cold environments or extreme heat environments, how we can equip the military with the appropriate clothing for the appropriate climatic conditions. And we do also recognize that climate change has an important gender aspect, and so we are looking to do research on the gender aspects of climate change as well. So in conclusion to this initial set of remarks, NATO takes climate change seriously. As Chief Scientist, I strongly support that with the NATO science, and we are looking forward, as I say, to an ambitious target of making NATO the leading international organization when it comes to understanding the impact of climate change on security, and NATO science is playing a key role in that. That concludes my opening remarks, and with that, I'll hand over to Elise, please.
Thanks so much, Brian. I'm happy to be joining you here from Roslyn, British Columbia, also known as Kaymarken by the original inhabitants, the Sinixt people, whose traditional territories I'm honored to live and work and play on. So while I am the only member of my immediate family not to have served in the Canadian Armed Forces, I can assure you that my childhood was that of a typical base brat, having lived on 7 military bases in my first 12 years, and regularly having dinner conversations that were filled with acronyms. So today, coming from more of a perspective that's closer to my center of knowledge, which includes engineering perspectives on climate risk and resilience planning, it'll be less so on my military capability. I've been working in design and construction of public infrastructure for over 20 years internationally. And then for the past 10 years, my practice has evolved into fully diving into understanding how climate change is impacting how we design and plan for infrastructure which supports communities, the economy, and operations within various organizations, which includes the Canadian Armed Forces. At WSP, I lead a multidisciplinary team of professionals to interpret the various scenarios of climate projections, and then we guide a risk management approach to incorporating them both into policy and design projects. Luckily, we have the benefit of direct access to about 10,000 subject matter experts within Canada and 55,000 worldwide. So a lot of collaboration and opportunity for learning from one another. I'd say over the past few years, we've been partnering with the Canadian government particularly to help deliver solutions for implementing their greening government strategy, which looks at both mitigation and adaptation to climate change and incorporating more sustainability in policy and operations. So while many of our climate risk projects have been civilian-led, they also include assessments of shared infrastructure at forward operating locations. This includes assessing the risk of permafrost thaw to runways and buildings at Arctic airports, including Inuvik and Rankin Inlet, the renewal of water and wastewater supply and treatment facilities in communities like Resolute and Iqaluit, and the risks of within the critical supply chain of delivering fuel between the oil fields in Alberta and communities in the Inuvialuit settlement region of the Beaufort Delta. Obviously, lots of different climate challenges there. So D&D is a partner in some of these projects, and in other areas, various levels of government responsible should be considering having that more, increased collaboration with the Defense Network. As we're going to, maybe be looking at Arctic sovereignty much more closely into the future, we should be accounting for a more permanent military presence in these northern communities and therefore be planning accordingly. We've worked with D&D coast to coast to coast, directly looking at climate risk to heritage buildings that were built post-World War II and are in need of upgrades. We are looking at coastal air transport wing, like at 19 Wing on the West Coast, and Royal Canadian Navy operations in Atlantic Canada and Nanisivik in Nunavut. So when I think about defense-centric technological innovation, to me that means being prepared. That means being prepared to lead increased collaboration within industry and within our allies. As with changing threats to defense, I think being prepared for an uncertain future relating to climate change really means not relying on historical information on which to support decision making. This means having access to reliable data and climate information, and also building sufficient capacity within military organizations on how to incorporate that range of uncertainty into future planning and long-term budgets. This is an evolving field, and I would say that many organizations are in the process of figuring out what it means for them, defense included. So as I'm talking about these policies and investment and funding cycles, these in the prioritization of it all, you need to factor in that uncertainty of climate change risk. Like if you were to take a project off of the shelf, which was prepared 5 years earlier, the design criteria is no longer going to be valid, nor will it be suitable to function when it's being called into service maybe 20 years from now. So while this could be a lengthy and expensive endeavor for defense departments who have decades of infrastructure deficit backlogs, you know, there's those added challenges for replacing like for like, when in reality, the infrastructure supporting military operations in the future are probably going to look quite different as national and global threats also change those demands for defense operations. So what can we do about that? You know, that first step is really assessing overall portfolios and prioritize those installations based on the criticality of operational roles and end of asset life. As climate risk management practitioners, we can guide that process. However, it must be a collaborative process involving defense personnel who are much more aware of the details and challenges of military operations, and also for the potential for technological change into the future. In terms of technology, you know, one of the lessons that we learned in British Columbia this past November during the atmospheric river event, in which the military was called in to support, was that climate change is now, and extreme events are becoming more severe and more frequent. A 2010 climate risk assessment for one of the highways that failed catastrophically had identified exactly the magnitude of climate event and the specific locations which were at high risk of failure, and that's exactly where they failed. Flooding disasters are approximately 6 times more expensive to repair than they are to prevent. So even when funding is not prioritized to update all of these areas, because you can't do it all at once, technologies can include forms of, you know, advanced warning systems for debris flow events, as an example. So that would limit the risk to public safety and potentially prepare for advanced maintenance and evacuations. In closing, I would say that the reliability of future climate projections from models is dependent on sufficient historic climate records. Climate is also very location dependent. So if you're including data from the nearest weather station, and in the Arctic, that could be over 500 kilometers from the location you're assessing, that may or may not give you good direction. I would say that the other challenge is that as engineers, we've not yet really learned to interpret and include traditional ecological knowledge into our scientific processes. So technology may not be our only advantage, and we actually have a lot to learn from our Indigenous partners who know this land far better than most and feel the impacts of climate change in all aspects of life compared to observing them from afar. And with that, I can imagine that Madeline will be able to pass that on.
You can go ahead there, Madeline.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I come to everyone today from Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. And I thank everyone for the opportunity of being able to share, you know, what is happening in Canada's north, or at least this part of our northern continent. So one of the problems inherently is that we lack marine data in Canada's Arctic. As a result, this hampers both the development of good policy and evidence-based decision-making. It means that we also have no environmental baseline data. This was particularly problematic when we had a foreign company that wanted to do seismic testing between Baffin Island and Greenland along the Baffin Bay. And what was particularly concerning was the company, and with actually the government of Canada's at that point in time approval, is to develop baseline data during seismic testing, and which is never a good thing because you're talking about developing baseline data in a marine environment that is under intense stress. The Inuit challenged that decision because we were aware that such activity, could pose tremendous harm to the marine ecosystem. Satellite absolutely is, currently our only means of telecommunications and connection to the outside world. Thankfully, it's working right now. It's often unstable. Last night, it was absolutely impossible to load a web page, send an email, receive an email, or do anything, online, because the weather even sort of hampers telecommunications here. And satellite imagery, has its limitations, not only with respect to sort of, the weather issues, but it doesn't provide us, a lot of good marine intelligence or marine environmental data, other than what's happening on the surface. And so this is why I'm involved in a company called Can-Arctic Inuit Networks, which is looking to build approximately up to 5,000 kilometers of subsea fiber optic cable from Labrador under phase 1 to Iqaluit, and under phase 2 to connect all the communities of the east coast of Baffin Island to the high Arctic. And under phase 3, some internal sort of connections to existing or recently built fiber optic in Nunavik, which is northern Quebec, as well as under phase 4, being able to extend the cable through the Northwest Passage, connect to Nunavik, provide much needed redundancy. Now, phases 2 and phases 4, right now we're in the process of doing a feasibility and viability study to see if, of making those 2 segments a smart cable. What does SMART stand for? Stands for Science, Monitoring, and Reliable Telecommunications. What that allows is sensors to be put on that cable. And the sensors can provide much needed baseline data, also real-time data with respect to the marine environment. Everything related to currents, salinity, temperature, pressure, and with hydrophones, noise that is on the surface of the marine environment or in the marine environment. This is incredibly important, not just for environmental protection, but also for in our conversations that we've had with defense or military folks, both in Canada and United States. They want marine intelligence as well. It's valuable for them when you have Coast Guard or the potential of vessels, not only to know for their own marine navigation, but also who's going through our waters. And combining the satellite intelligence and marine intelligence effectively gives our country and our continent and our allies all domain awareness. It's been, there's more and more information about the value to, not just simply try to work with the minimal amount of data that we have. More data allows us to, as I said, understand who's in our waters, but also appropriate and timely responses. So in closing, the smart cable provides not only reliable telecommunications, something that our communities desperately need and want, something that the military and defense also require. It also provides the opportunity to develop a Arctic blue economy. Jobs and training are incredibly important. The data is the new gold, is the new oil. And through artificial intelligence, we can collect that data, analyze it, and use it for multiple purposes. And at the end of the day, this is smart investments. It's a strategic investment. It's multi-purpose, multi-user, and multi-beneficial. So we're really excited by the opportunity of having a Nunavut-based, Inuit-led telecommunications and sensor high-tech project that we understand is not only good for our region, good for our communities, good for our people, but also good for our national security and national and intercontinental sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the three of you, for those introductions. And if I had to characterize what you can really pull out of all three of them as we move towards the discussion part of this panel, it's very clear that data is an important consideration and plays a very significant role as we go about managing the very wide scope of the climate crisis. I mean, it isn't simply that we're measuring change over time, because we're pushing towards the future as well. If we look at IPCC AR6 reports and all the future projections, we are trying to prepare ourselves for different emission scenarios and different possibilities for what the world may look like in a changing climate. But what is also clear is that data access, or the amount of data available, is very different for industry and civilians and the military alike. So what I would like to pose to the panel as we get started is, first and foremost, where are we seeing the biggest issues as far as data sharing is concerned? And what can we do to really remedy them for the benefit of both parties? And are there areas moving outside data where you can envision that greater cooperation may be able to manifest, or is there a particular area that is currently undervalued? And maybe we'll start with Elise.
Yeah, it's always fun to find the mute button first. It makes my heart sing to hear everybody talking about data, because we've been doing this work for a long time. We were looking at the naval refueling station in Nanisivik, and we're dealing with air photos from 1975, 1991, and 2021 to determine rates of change. And we're seeing that the coast is eroding at a rate of 0.5 meter to 1 meter. And to wait 30 years between those two data points doesn't give you any opportunity to do anything about that. I make the assumption that there's a record of satellite images in the region, and Madeline can confirm that, and it's good to have that in all regions then, and not just for a specific project. I think that what we end up seeing fairly often is that the data that we can collect is focused only on a certain project, and then it gets filed away in that project, and then it's not shared again. There were mining operations in Nanisivik for years and decades, and then all of a sudden, all that data that may have existed previously isn't available, even to the federal government. So making sure that we are, it comes to document management and filing and making sure that we, share information across departments. I know Brian is, has some thoughts on this, even with, sometimes the challenges of levels of classification of data and what's protected and what's not. But figuring out what actually needs to be classified and what can actually be shared in the public domain will really help all areas of industry share data.
Brian, do you maybe want to touch on that classification bit, because I know that it's something that we've previously discussed together, and it kind of shocked me as part of that discussion with just how difficult it is for things to be passed around internally, yet alone externally.
Mark, thank you. It is an issue. Even within individual nations, it can be difficult to share data either from one military service to another, or from one government department to another, and so data sharing even between like-minded nations becomes difficult as well. It's a difficult issue, and almost irrespective of what classification it is, you can deduce conclusions about capabilities just from the sort of image that you have. And as Chief Scientist, I'm as frustrated as Elise is on this. All I can say is that it's a recognized problem. It's not unique to climate change, and NATO has appointed a chief information officer, as have a lot of both national governments and departments. And one of the jobs is to look at sharing of information in the round. Thank you.
Madeline, do you have anything to add there?
Yes, the old adage used to be captains think of battles while generals think of trucks, to illustrate the importance of logistics. In the digital era, the generals are thinking about how to move data packets, and lots of them. So data, without a doubt, is what we need to understand what is happening in our environment, but also how to plan for, not only climate change, but in the context of national security. We need data, and we need as much of it as possible, especially in our Canadian Arctic. Data infrastructure is absolutely part of NORAD modernization, and it has to be prioritized, given especially with the Russians' invasion of Ukraine.
And I think that translates very well into an idea centered on being able to leverage technology gains through defense. Like defense imperatives and subsequently defense spending, we often think have been the cause for rapid advances in technological innovation. If the military is working on something that is new and on the cutting edge, usually there's the funding there and the means there to produce and provide these technological responses that may be out of reach for, say, industry partners. But we want to ensure that both defense policy and defense industry alike are occupying a position of leadership in this regard, rather than being a laggard that follows in the footsteps of the public sector and kind of remains behind in key areas of prioritization that a number of speakers have already referred to today. So how do we ensure that not only we hold policymakers accountable, but ensure that the defense industry continues to make these key innovative steps as we move toward facing the climate crisis? And I'll welcome any of you to jump in and start on that.
Mark, if I can start myself, for sure, defense needs to show leadership in climate change. I'm fully with you on that. But let's just think about technology and the role of defense industry here. If we were to wind the clock back 30 years, say, I would entirely agree with you that the defense sector, the science in the defense sector, drove scientific and technological innovation. But I don't think that's now the case. We've only got to think of the sorts of investments of Tesla, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, which completely swamp the investments of the defence sector, both government and industry. So defence no longer drives technological innovation as a general statement. It's done in the civil sector. What defence technology can do is look at, as it were, the delta of science and technology that is needed to draw the work of the civil sector and adapt it for specifically defence needs. So, for example, in quantum technologies, for example, the civil investment in those is massive, but defence has some specific defence applications, particularly in quantum sensing, for example, but not in quantum technologies in the round. And I think exactly the same is generally applicable to the sorts of technological advances needed to mitigate climate change. That we're seeing huge amounts of research in civil industry on new propellants, new means of propulsion. I would say the job of the defence scientists is to work out where defence-specific science needs to be done to build on that. We can easily think of applications of forward operating bases, for example, where there are some unique defence-specific requirements. And indeed, I am talking to a number of civil companies to learn what they are doing in climate change as a guide to NATO's own science and technology support. So yes, defence should provide leadership in climate change, but the particular role of defence science and defence industry is, I would argue, to provide leadership in those areas that are defence specific. Thank you.
Can probably tie into that because I was thinking about aviation and some of the work that some of my colleagues do. In aviation, there's long been a partnership between the civilian and military. However, kind of post World War II, that innovation has been particularly led mostly by civilians. Right now, I've got colleagues in the US and Sweden who are working on both sides of that climate change issue within the aviation industry. Firstly, to understand what that transition kind of between a fossil fuel-centric aviation operation and the infrastructure that's required to support that, switch to net zero propulsion, which may include hydrogen, electrification, and sustainable aviation fuels, as Brian was mentioning. If dual systems are going to need to be supported during the transition, what does that look like? Maybe the civilian aviation industry is going to be moving towards, these non-fossil fuels, but will that have sufficient propulsion requirements for military aircraft? So that is that gap where the military can take the lead and build off of what's already been done. And I think that there's really a place there then for partnerships between industry, academia, different levels of government, and NATO, like internationally. When we're looking at resilience, which is definitely the focus of my practice, looking at resilience of airport infrastructure, we should be looking at, again, data-informed decision-making, at looking what the increases to temperature changes are going to do on runway lengths, changes to wind, what's going to happen with predominant winds that may impact runway length, and then therefore that trickles down into the type of aircraft that can be used and the payloads of those aircraft. Changes to free slaw cycles, looking at pavement design, that's stuff that can all be done by the civilian industry, because it's going to be consistent across. That's not something that the military needs to invest in necessarily. However, certainly supporting that and building on that is part of that collaboration that I think needs to continue.
And then maybe I'll just add that, you know, we need to see more collaboration. Something Elise had mentioned, you know, but also internally within even the Canadian federal departments, there's been too long silos. And if we're going to, with our limited taxpayer funding, invest in infrastructure in our most rural, remote, and Arctic Canada, then we need to ensure that that infrastructure not only meets, you know, what our community needs are, the academic and scientific sector for research, but also for defense. And ideally, that this infrastructure, you know, can have that multi-purpose, multi-user, multi-benefit. But too often, everyone's sort of been working in isolation of each other. So the Department of Science and Economic Development and Innovation, the military, the Department of Environment and Climate Change, in my own sort of experience as a former politician and now as someone back in business, I can tell you that it's very challenging and very frustrating, you know, trying to actually work on a project that has that multi-purpose, multi-benefit, you know, where the departments, you know, it's almost like can't compute, you know, it has to fit into one narrow box rather than something that is you know, can have a cross benefit, you know, between civilian, academia, science, and military. So we've got to be much smarter and much more strategic in the way that we work and the way that we invest.
Yeah, and I think that it is something that, say, the IDEAS program does fairly well in a number of cases. Particular or relevant to this discussion is the current sub-zero infrastructure program that IDEAS is working with on, you know, safekeeping assets in the Arctic. But, you know, the bureaucracy question is something that I think that we always need to keep in mind, and ensuring that, you know, government's not only working, but working efficiently. Moving on, I think that it's very difficult, of course, to have a conversation on climate change without discussing the fact that it is, you know, now, it's fast, it's happening, it's in progress, and it's unfolding at a very alarming rate. So when we discuss adaptation and mitigation efforts alike, there's a realization that we have to place significant priority on, you know, some short-term changes, yet still have to contend with those longer-term future scenarios. So what can defense actually learn from other industries as far as prioritization and feasibility on green initiatives are concerned? And at the same time, I know that Madeline can speak to this quite well. What features of the Arctic domain make it a very difficult environment to plan and subsequently, you know, carry out these infrastructure projects, developments, and you know, undertakings that we require?
Well, maybe I'll speak to that. Is, you know, there's been an historical, or even to some extent a current attitude that the North is too big, it's too far, it's too small of a population, worthy of the significant investments. And yet what we've seen for decades is actually a lot of money having been spent in this region, and not necessarily the Band-Aid approach has cost too much. And actually the bigger, you know, smarter investments would have been more long-term and more beneficial, both for the people who live here, but also for, as I said, you know, academia, scientists, and our defense. So a big attitude and awareness shift actually, I think, needs to happen if we're going to ensure that we move away from ghettoizing, you know, our Arctic, and actually becoming like our Arctic neighbors, where we've seen them make significant, investments and benefit from the significant returns of those investments. And so Greenland, Alaska, the Nordic countries, and even Russia are much further ahead than us in Canada. So with the NORAD modernization, I think there's a real opportunity to make those investments that addresses the climate change reality, sort of begins to future-proof our communities and future-proof, even the defense sector, and is actually fulfilling what we're supposed to be doing as not only as a partner with the United States, but as a member of NATO.
Elise, do you want to jump in there, especially on the the difficulties surrounding sort of the infrastructure pipeline in the north?
Yeah, and Mark, it's something that you and I talked about earlier, was kind of the long-term relationship the length of a project that happens in the north, from conception to design to procurement, dealing with very short and unpredictable construction seasons. And so if you're going to make that investment once, you should kind of look at the rest of it. If we're going to be updating a wastewater treatment plant in Resolute, and there's a Canadian Arctic Training Center there, perhaps that wastewater treatment plant should be designed to be modular so that it could be easily added on. The components are the same. You've got the same spare parts. All of these things, you've got the same process, so that whoever is there operating it has the capacity to operate it in a larger fashion, and work with the communities in advance, and not just say, oh, we're going to provide this for this small community, but really leverage the technology there. The other thing that I was going to point out here is some of the pilot testing that's being done in the mining industry, for example, where they're electrifying their heavy duty fleet. They're testing it out. They've got the funds to do so, and they've got the incentive to do so because they're operating in northern communities, in northern harsh environments, in remote environments where that supply chain is limited. I think that there leads a lot of opportunity to research and do development of remote power generation and storage solutions, which are also not that resource intensive, because again, when we go to the electrification of everything, that increases mining because we need to have the metals that then go into the storage solutions. In my region, as an example, they're testing out solar power facilities in an area where they can easily access it, so that then will meet the demands of their unique operations and remote operations in Alaska and South America. So I think that moving forward, providing solutions that are also mobile, and I think Brian can also speak to this, is some of the challenges with military operations is that these solutions also need to be mobile, they need to operate in harsh conditions, and they need to be easy to operate.
Mark, if I can come in on a number of these considerations. One of the things that scientists can do with policymakers is to work up options for political leaders, because you're undoubtedly right in your opening remarks to this question. Climate change is now. That could well lead to looking for low-hanging fruit, as it were, what can be done quickly. That might not be the same as what is the best long-term priority, or indeed what can be done cheaply. So there are options here, and science is really good at doing systems analysis or operational research and analysis to work through these scenarios in a holistic way, to generate what can be done quickly, where should the longer term priority be given to funding, and ultimately what is affordable within a particular time frame. Just to pick up Elise's point about mobility, yes, we have undertaken some gaming of tabletop exercises on new technologies against a range of potential future NATO missions. And what we found was that with the increasing digitization of military capabilities, these all need power. And the very generation of power in a remote place is going to be difficult, and we want to do that in a green fashion as well. So there are some very specific military issues around the use of power in the future for the increasingly digital military capabilities that we have. Thank you.
And maybe I could just quickly add in is that it's important that, good telecommunications infrastructure requires power. And as Brian just said, that's why it's important to also potentially look at, even something like small modular reactors or micro modular reactors, and assess things from both a macro and micro perspective. What can work in a particular northern community, and are there the opportunity to do inter-community or inter-regional sort of investments in infrastructure related to telecommunications, power, and transportation. Those are the big three, essential elements for, most of us in our communities, but also for, and I'm glad Elise mentioned it, the mining sector. We need to bring them into those conversations, and then also, for our national security and national interests. So
what I think that tells us is, strategy is a huge part of this, whether it's from a defense perspective, whether it's from an engineering perspective. And, you can go a number of different directions in addressing particular strategies. One question that I was kind of mulling over, especially with regard to Arctic infrastructure, is whether there's arguments to be made on, moving towards retrofits versus new construction, because you're in this sort of intermediary space between, existing conditions and now changing conditions. And is it better to plan for a potential future, or is it better to, work with what you have, because there's a bit of a gray area there. I'm not sure if you want to touch on that. It's a point of, personal inquiry. There is a question from the audience specifically for Dr. Wells, and that's what would you like to see the new NATO CAS-COE prioritize, or a particular avenue for prioritization for that new initiative?
Thank you. That is a really great question. I'm already working with my colleagues in the Canadian science sector on how the NATO Science and Technology Organization can link with the Center of Excellence that is being stood up. For me, I think NATO, having set out this action plan for climate change and security, let us be very clear, this is early days for that action plan. It was launched by NATO leaders at the last summit, and it will receive its first impact report at the upcoming summit at the end of June of this year. So it is very much early days for the Alliance. I hope that colleagues in the Centre of Excellence will look at that action plan and assess where NATO needs to focus its efforts. And again, rather like I've just said, there are things you can do early, and there are things that might have a higher priority in the longer term. Start helping us work through some of those issues and help NATO headquarters and the wider NATO enterprise understand where its strengths are, understand where it needs to do near-term work and longer-term investment as well. As I say, I've got a great relationship with scientific colleagues in Canada who are looking at the science of the Centre of Excellence. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the NATO angle is interesting because we're aware that partnerships and collaboration are kind of the name of the game when it comes to tackling climate change as a commons issue. And perhaps one of the disconnects that we see is that, you know, it's tough for cooperation to be functionally intense because, you know, different states are prioritizing based on their individual need. Yet we still find that we want to seek those avenues for cooperation and collaboration. Yet it's fairly difficult, it seems, to do so. But this new initiative is offering an opportunity to maybe jump past that. Some of those regional differences that NATO members certainly face, and you know, Canada's approach to the Arctic will be very different than say the Scandinavian approach to the Arctic, for example. With that, we are running a little short on time. Just if I wanted to, I'll ask the three of you if you had any sort of final thoughts on technological approaches and where you might in your day-to-day, you know, kind of see an avenue that we think we should be exploring further, or you think that we need to take away from this conference, this summit, as something to focus on as a priority moving forward. And maybe I'll start with Madeline.
Thank you. You know, maybe just to speak, you know, on your point earlier, is that we know that, you know, decades of sort of inadequate investments have not borne fruit and have resulted in a region of our country that, you know, has high rates of poverty, high rates of overcrowded housing, high rates of food insecurity, and that if we can envision a different, you know, Arctic, a smart Arctic, one where it is prosperous, one where, you know, these investments not only help our people, but contribute to a much stronger Canada and a much stronger Canadian partner with United States and our NATO allies, we will be a much better country for it. And every dollar that we invest in our north, if we do it right, can actually result in a lot more money into our national economy, as we've seen in the other Arctic regions.
Elise?
You know, I'm going to harp on the collaboration. You know, this is not something that is going to be solved in silos, and we've been operating in silos for a long time in many industries, even in my organization, you know, within levels of government, within, you know, multinational. You know, on the weekend I was reading about the Snowflake International Arctic Station in the foothills of the Arctic Urals. And so what they're doing, it's supposed to be an international partnership between the Russian government and Norway and potentially, you know, other nations to have a carbon-free technology research center in the Arctic, looking for environmentally friendly energy solutions. And a hub of international cooperation towards a sustainable Arctic. Considering the current situation in Ukraine, having partnerships with Russia becomes a little bit more complex in that kind of you know, academic research in situations. So if you know, we can call on NATO members to reconsider what this means for shared research and understanding that, you know, the other side is preparing for this, and that we should be as well. You know, and in closing, I'd say the first action to climate adaptation is mitigation, because the faster we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, the less we're going to have to adapt into the future. Thanks. I'll leave it to Brian.
Last word, Brian.
Thank you very much. 2 points. The first is technology provides the means to adapt, to mitigate, and to understand climate change. Technology is improving all the time. Second point, to pick up Elisa's point, that NATO offers a terrific way of working in collaboration on these sciences, sharing a scientific problem amongst nations and including like-minded partners, sharing the costs, sharing the expertise. We've got a great track record of doing that, and this is an area where the allies can work together really very effectively indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists and the audience for sticking around with us for this panel. And I will pass it back to Yuri.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark, Elise, Brian, Madeline, great panel. Thanks for being here with us today. We're going to take a little 5-minute break, everyone, and we'll do mic checks in the background, and we'll join you back in a few minutes. Thank you so much.